Good morning, everybody, and apologies to some of you who've been waiting. We just had a few technical issues to iron out. We've been doing this since 2020, but every time there's got to be something. It's become a Zoom webinar tradition. But thank you for bearing with us, and it's an honor to be here with our speakers. Hello, my name is Naureen Chowdhury Fink. I'm the Executive Director of the Soufan Center, an independent organization focused on research, analysis, and strategic dialogue to foster understanding of global security issues. Thank you to all of us who are joining for this very important discussion today. Recent years have witnessed a growing focus on the impact of hostage-taking and wrongful detentions, with state actors increasingly joining non-state actors, including terrorist groups and criminal organizations, in holding foreign citizens. The world watched in horror as hostages were grotesquely murdered by ISIS, and many countries globally have watched as terrorist groups sought to capitalize on the suffering of their citizens. This year, we saw the prosecution of two members of the notorious ISIS hostage-taking cell known as the Beatles. The families of the American victims of ISIS have been vocal in their wishes for these individuals to be held accountable for their actions in a US court of law. This recent trial was also a testament to the resolve of the families who have been pursuing justice and accountability for their family members for years. Also this year, the US government officially determined that American female basketball superstar and WNBA athlete Brittany Griner was and continues to be wrongfully detained by the Russian government, highlighting the risks posed by state actors. Just last week, the UN convened a Global Congress of Victims of Terrorism, an important occasion to highlight the importance of justice and accountability for victims and their families, but also to stress the importance of supporting hostages and their families throughout these complex processes. The trends and developments that we've discussed set the tone for our discussion today. In a global political climate defined by growing geopolitical uncertainty and fractured relations between the US and many international and regional powers, what are the future implications for the US government? What will justice and accountability look like in this climate? What lessons learned can countries share in terms of ensuring safe outcomes for their citizens and learning from each other in terms of policy and practice? And as the international community commences important deliberations during the 77th session of the UN General Assembly, what does multilateral cooperation look like in this space? I'm delighted to be able to hand over the screen now to the moderator for today's webinar, Mr. Ali Velshi, an award-winning journalist and host of Velshi on MSNBC. He has covered multiple US presidential elections and many major news stories around the globe. Ali, the screen is yours. Thank you for joining us.
Noreen, thank you to you. Thank you for the Soufan Center, to the Soufan Center for convening this conversation. For many people in our audience, this is an obvious conversation. It's something that with which you are all familiar. For some, it may be less so, but there are nuances in the differences between state actors and non-state actors, and what we then think of as unjust and unlawful, and what role the State Department or governments or multilateral arrangements can have on this. And it seems to be an increasing problem. So it's a timely matter for us to discuss with two remarkable experts. Joshua Geltzer is the Deputy Assistant to the President and the Deputy Homeland Security Advisor. He is sort of the administration's, the executive branch's point person on it, but the Department of State obviously is always a key player in this and in negotiations and deliberations around hostages or people who are unlawfully held, and Ambassador Roger Carstens is the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. I can't think of two better people to have this conversation with. So without much fanfare, I'm gonna throw it over to Joshua to start with, and then to Ambassador Carstens for a few opening remarks, as long or as short as you'd like, because we will get it all out in the course of either our discussion or some of the questions that I'm already seeing come in. This is an easy lift for me because I've got two expert panelists and a lot of expert guests. So Josh, let's start with you. Welcome to both of you, and thanks for being here. And Josh, your opening comments on this.
Ali, thanks to you for being part of this conversation today, and thanks to Ali Soufan, the Soufan Center, Naureen for bringing us all together, and thanks as well to Roger, with whom I get to speak often and work on these issues. A true honor and privilege, but I'm grateful to him for being part of this discussion today. I'll keep these remarks at the outset brief because I really am interested in this being a conversation, but I'll pick up on one point I think both Naureen and Ali have made already, which is we're seeing a trend, and it's an appalling trend. It's a trend of governments in particular using human beings as bargaining chips, as pawns, as political tools. That's not brand new. We've seen governments do it before, and we've certainly seen non-state actors, terrorists, pirates, criminals do this sort of thing. But governments, as they seek influence with the US government and other governments in a challenging and complex and evolving global landscape, increasingly seem to turn to this particular and horrific and appalling tool to try to make it part of their statecraft. And I think it's on us as the US government to do at least two things. One, most simply, bring Americans home. Bring those who are held hostage or wrongfully detained home to their families and friends where they belong. And second, prevent, deter, and otherwise stop others, especially other Americans, because that's our foremost responsibility, from being in that position and from their friends and families being in that position of missing them and working with us to bring them home. And Roger and I and our colleagues are doing a lot on both, but I'm sure we'll get into that in the discussion, Ali. So let me stop there for now.
Josh, thank you. It's a great start. We appreciate that. Ambassador, great to see you. Thank you for being here. You guys are two sides of the same coin, working really from the same playbook on how to get wrongfully, unlawfully, and unjustly detained people back to their home. Give me your perspective on this to start with. Oh, I think you're muted.
I'm one of those from an older generation. This computer stuff is still rather foreign to me. But Ali, thanks for hosting this and moderating this panel. It's wonderful to work with you on this and grateful for your interest. Naureen, thank you also for bringing this panel together. Very grateful for the Soufan group to put this together. I talk to Ali quite often. In fact, last night, this morning, and usually when I'm coming home from work at 9 o'clock every night. So working with the Soufan team has just been an amazing part of what we do here. And it speaks to the broadening of the hostage recovery enterprise, which I can probably talk to in a second. But grateful for all the people in the audience. I feel like even though I'm held accountable at times and always given some tough questions, I feel that the people who do so are a part of a broader family. I'm sure I'll know a lot of the people in the audience, and I always welcome them asking those hard questions, holding us accountable, and frankly, just being a part of trying to bring Americans home. So with that, I wouldn't mind just jumping into this. If I could take a minute or two to tell you a little bit for those who may not be entirely, I guess, invested in what we're doing. I'd like to explain a few things. And the first thing is my office, SPEHA, we have 4 different duties. First and foremost, as you can imagine, our job is to bring people home, those that are held hostage and those who've been wrongfully detained. Secondly,
Ambassador, I'm going to stop you there for a second. There's something blocking your screen. There we go. It's gone. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, forgive me. The second thing we do is we try to work on connecting with the families, partnering with them, giving them information, providing resources that can help them get through this trying time. One of the most important being to keep them briefed, updated, and a part of the strategy sessions that we hold. The third thing that we're doing is we're trying to build out and implement the Levingston Act and the President's July of 2022 executive order. Lastly, and Josh kind of hinted to this, we're building out a deterrence strategy that hopefully will one day take this horrific practice and put it on the dustbin of history. So the US government and the wrongful detainee enterprise, it's really a fantastic interagency collaboration between the State Department, the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell, which that will come together to bring hostages and wrongful detainees home. Now, while the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell takes the lead on supporting families of those who are wrongfully detained. Families and non-government organizations like the Soufan Center are just absolutely valued partners. We just cannot do this stuff alone, and we're grateful to have people working with us in our efforts not only to bring people home, but to take care of the families as well. Now, part of this partnership is making sure that these families have everything they need. Some examples I can give you is we've worked to provide mental health providers recommendations, case updates, everything down to troubleshooting issues that might have occurred with the IRS while someone's been detained in a foreign country. And this is not always easy. A lot of the stuff that we do is very classified. And so in bringing news to the families, updating them, bringing them in on the strategies, sometimes we're not able to give them the pure, full, I guess, spectrum of what we're trying to do. And that can be painful in itself because they're already undergoing the agony and trauma of not having their loved ones there. And frankly, they want, and we owe them as fulsome an update as we can possibly give them. As a part of that, as soon as someone's taken, I'm usually on an aircraft within 7 to 10 days. I will fly down along with 1 or 2 of my team members, and we'll sit in the living rooms of the people, of the families of the person that's being held hostage or wrongfully detained. And we'll spend 3 or 4 hours trying to get a sense of who the detainee is, what their life is like, understand the family's concerns, get a little more of the story, but then also give them a sense that there's a government team that's not going to act as government as usual. We're going to connect with them. We're going to cry with them. We're going to be angry with them. We're going to communicate. If you need to call someone at 2 in the morning because you're just not feeling good about what's happening, you can call SPEHA and someone's going to pick up the phone and cry with you. We try to let them know that we're going to be in the trenches with them on this effort to bring their loved ones home. We also tell them we're going to partner with them. I can't tell you how many times a family that has a different perspective has been able to offer a strategy or a thought or a tactic that no one in the State Department would have ever come up with, mainly because every day I walk into the State Department and I put on a suit and tie, I surrender a good chunk of my creativity. It's just something that happens. And in talking to the family members, I've been stunned and amazed and gratified to see the energy and intellectual power that they bring to bear on bringing their loved ones home. So we partner with them as well. I think the last thing is we try to give them a sense either through talking to them or giving them the family resource guide that we published. By the way, published in conjunction with the families, worked with them and to build a family resource guide that kind of answered the mail. But in talking to them, we're able to give them a sense of who in the government is handling this job. We'll talk about Josh Geltzer in the NSC. We'll talk about DOD. We'll talk about who in the State Department is doing this, the people at the embassy in the country in question, the people that run the regional side of the house here. And why that's important is they get a sense that it's not just Roger Carstens and 3 other people. There could be like 50, 100, 300 people all working on a case between the entire interagency, meeting often. So while the perception might be from Minot, North Dakota, or from Orlando, Florida, or wherever these families are, that there's no activity, we try to express that there's a ton of activity. This is our full-time job. This is what we do. Someone is on the case. And it's important, I think, to give them a sense of, I guess, comfort to know that when they go to bed at night, they've done their job. Their job was to partner with us. At that point, Josh and I and the rest of the team up here try to, and frankly, when I say the rest of the team, I'm talking about the Ali Velshis, the Soufan group, the congressmen and senators, the third-party intermediaries that are experts in negotiating. All these people are coming to bear in a wide hostage enterprise to bring their loved ones home. And so they can go to bed at night feeling like they've done their job, and then we start to do ours. But again, in a partnership. I would say in the conversations with these families, we try to tell them about everything that's going on. There's a line when it gets up to classified information that I can't cross. But I would say that when we leave a family and to give them a sense of where we are, most families have a pretty good idea of where we are in the timeline and what strategies we're going to try to implement. Usually the secret things are things that are very detailed oriented. So you can usually give people a good sense of where they are on the playing field without getting into classified information. I'd say lastly, maybe because I'm talking quite a bit, well, not lastly, let me say 2 things. Number one is when someone comes home, Josh and I and a lot of the NGOs work on how to bring someone back into and reintegrate them into society and their family life as a whole. We call it post-isolation support activities. It really could just be termed post-hostage or wrongful detention care. It could be anything from mental health referrals to getting physicals, making sure that they have their immediate healthcare needs are taken care of, things like that, to make sure that we're giving them kind of a soft landing in terms of their reintegration into essentially their lives, reclaiming agency in their lives. And the second thing is, and we talked about it before, it's deterrence. Secretary Blinken and President Biden, the secretary through a chat that he had with me in April of last year, the president, through the executive order, are determined to come up with deterrent strategies that raise the cost of taking hostages and wrongful detainees to a level that, again, we hope this extinguishes hostage taking and wrongful detention taking as a tool of diplomacy for the nations that continue to want to do so. Thank you for your time. Again, grateful for a chance to ask some, or rather offer some comments, and I'm looking forward to your questions and those in the audience.
Ambassador, thank you for that. I appreciate it. You know, foreign governments now surpass terrorist and extremist groups and militant groups as the predominant hostage taker of U.S. nationals around the globe. There are estimated to be about 60 Americans being held hostage overseas, the majority of which are held by state actors. It's a trend that is referred to by some as hostage diplomacy. Josh, you talked about these people becoming pawns. Now, I happen to travel to a lot of places where my greatest danger as a prominent journalist would be state actors, not generally non-state actors. And Ali Soufan, like for a lot of people, is on my speed dial, and everybody knows if anything were to happen to call him. And he told me some years ago, as I was going to one country that was a practitioner of this hostage diplomacy, bordering another country which was sort of ruled by terrorists and militants. And he said, I don't want anybody taking you hostage or prisoner, but one of these is going to be easier to solve than the other. And at the time, he felt that those militants who might take me, who generally speaking are looking for money, might be an easier solve than a state actor. He said, there are some countries you go to, if the state takes you, it's a lot harder. Josh, your take on that?
It can be a lot harder, and it's hard to categorize too broadly here, because even within the two main buckets we're talking about, governments and non-state actors, there can be a variety of motives, both for initial taking and for then holding on to Americans and to others, as appalling as that is. It can be money in some cases. It can be publicity, and we've seen publicity taken to the point where release was not really ever available. Instead, the publicity of holding someone and ultimately slaughtering them was what, in particular, terrorist groups sought at one point, and indeed sometimes seek again. For governments, of course, they can seek release of their own citizens, despite the lack of parity, despite the fact that anyone in a U.S. Justice system has received the benefits of due process of law, of access to counsel, of a whole host of rights. Despite that total asymmetry, it can be what is sought by a foreign government, or foreign governments can seek other to use them as leverage for other things that they want from our government. But it is true that when a government in particular holds an American, at times that can be the hardest type of case, especially if what they're seeking is something we genuinely cannot provide, because sometimes governments refuse to accept what's feasible or not feasible for the government to do. I don't even mean acceptable. I mean actually doable and feasible, but also because it should not come as a surprise, and it does not come as a surprise to those of us who work on it, that the same entities, including governments, that would take the horrific step of using human beings as bargaining chips are not then good faith negotiators when you in fact get across the table for them. That's not a coincidence. That shouldn't surprise anyone. It flows from the same appalling willingness to use human beings as bargaining chips. And so even though we will and we should go to great lengths as a government to get across that table, and once we're across that table, figure out how we resolve the situation, we often find that those on the other side of the table from us, those who've taken this horrific step in the first place, do not have easily met or sometimes even articulable demands. That adds to the challenge of all of this in the ways I think you heard, Ali, from Ali.
I was going to say, you brought that full circle into, I think that's what he may have been trying to tell me, that there are more complex challenges perhaps with some of these state actors. And I think the point, Ambassador, is that none of this is black and white, right? There are non-state actors who I suppose have a great range of motivations and possible solutions to this, and state actors who do the same thing. You talked about establishing deterrence. Through both the Levinson Act, the executive order, but talk to me about the sort of moving target. How do you establish deterrence when there are lots and lots of reasons why state actors would get involved in this practice?
Ali, great question. I think first off, briefly, When I took this job, I went to see my two predecessors, Jim O'Brien and Robert O'Brien. And in both cases, they said, Roger, there's no playbook for this. Every case is unique. We're experienced lawyers. You're not going to be able to come up with a lessons learned on how to get these cases done. And in my heart of hearts, I knew they were wrong, because surely if you think about these cases long enough, you're going to come up with different ways of approaching every single case. So I was determined to find a cookie cutter approach that would allow me to deal with the Russias, the Chinas, the Irans, and the terrorist groups out there. And after 2.5 years in this job, I can say firmly that they were both right. There is no cookie cutter approach to doing this. Every case is unique. Every case is specific. Even cases from a captor network or a captor country seem to have differences that require different approaches. But I think on the deterrence side, I think what we've done is a lot of times we might reach into the toolkit of the US government, and when we think messaging, or might go to a certain small suite of tools. And what Josh and I are trying to do on behalf of the president and the secretary is to broaden that toolkit to where we can instead identify tools that have never been used before, and tools that we have used before but have never put in the service of trying to deter or punish those who take Americans. And we want to do that just not in very small lanes, but across the entire elements of US national power. So picture a toolkit that includes different things from that come from the diplomatic realm, the intelligence side of the house, the military, economic, law enforcement, financial, legal, to bring all these power tools and put them on the table, and then start building a deterrence strategy which can be applicable to the country or the cases in question. It's going to take a lot of creativity, but we're working on the toolkit right now. I think we have the entire interagency interested in seeing how they can contribute. And once we get this down, our goal is to make sure that we're talking to our allies, trying to encourage them to partner with us. Because once you get 10, 12, 20, 30, 40 countries applying some of the tools that they have within their national power, you can start to put a dent in this and one day just raise the cost. Picture a future one day when a citizen of Botswana is taken by a country, and the United States and about 30 other countries come to the aid of the Botswanans and say, we're here to help, we want to support you. And by doing so, all 30 countries are going to act as if they have skin in the game, put diplomatic pressure or military pressure, law enforcement pressure, et cetera, on the country in question. At that point, a lot of countries are going to realize that it no longer makes sense and it's too costly to take a nation's citizens.
It's a really interesting segue here, because Josh, what the ambassador's talking about, I guess in current terms that people would understand with Ukraine, is almost like a NATO response, right? The idea that this harm is a harm to many of us or all of us in the world, so we must come together to challenge it. The problem, of course, even as we look at Ukraine and NATO, is that it takes a really big thing that has an effect on a lot of people for the world to register that this is terrible. We have fewer examples of success when a country does something to a few people or takes a few people. We had the Magnitsky Act, which is probably a relatively good example of, if you are a human rights abuser, even if it's to 2 or 3 people, we will do things collectively to punish you. But I think part of the problem here is it's some of this is classified information. It doesn't all get out there. And how do you motivate a world around a unified attempt to rescue what amounts to a few dozen people?
Let me give the answer in 2 parts. One is how we do it multilaterally, and the other is how we set an example that we can then take to that multilateral group. So in terms of how we do it multilaterally, very early in his tenure as Secretary of State Blinken enthusiastically embraced a Canadian-led initiative to build the global norm against arbitrary detention, against these sorts of practices. He's been vocal about it ever since. Roger has obviously been critical to the State Department's leadership, but what that has shown is a willingness to link arms and to say, we will do this with allies. We will try to form the set of countries that react at the same time with the same horror, which then raises the question of what is this? What is it that is triggered by the latest hostage taking or wrongful detention? And there, we've tried to lead by example. So we have in late 2000, the passage of the Levinson Act, which creates a structured approach for figuring out who's in and who's out in the first place. 11 factors now set out in US federal law that Roger's team, the Consular Affairs section of the State Department, the lawyers at the State Department, and the relevant regional bureau at State all look at together when there's a new instance of an American being held by a foreign government to determine whether this individual, whether this detention should be deemed unlawful or wrongful. That's structuring the inquiry of who's in and who's out, ultimately with a recommendation that goes to the secretary. Then what are the punishments for those who do it? That's where this summer's executive order promulgated by President Biden comes in, which takes some authorities in the Levinson Act and makes it possible for the State Department, for the Treasury Department, to bring to bear a range of penalties against those in or out of government who are part of this sort of action. Financial penalties like asking them from ever getting visas to come to U.S. soil. So we think we can lead by example and then take that back to the multilateral grouping and make those the sorts of penalties that give real teeth to the global norm.
We have a lot of really good questions coming up, so I'm going to shortly start taking those questions. But Ambassador, I want to ask you a couple of things. In a world in which it is becoming increasingly clear we have allies and we have adversaries, and in a situation where there are state actors where we talk about unjust holding of people versus unlawful, these become tricky things. Brittany Griner's detention is deemed lawful by the Russian Federation. Everybody convicted by the Russian Federation is deemed to be held lawfully. It may not be our law. It may be very clear that it's unjust, and Russia is not an ally. So there are all sorts of competing and concentric circles in determining how you apply what Joshua was just talking about.
Ali, absolutely. The criteria that was given to us in the Levinson Act and passed into public law has been very helpful. So we'll use a case like Brittany Griner's, for example. Is she perhaps guilty of what she was charged with? Perhaps. I will tell you that Russia and China seem to have, I think China has a 99% conviction rate. I think Russia is probably not too far behind that. So that kind of speaks to the integrity of their legal system. Truly, there are Americans that go to Russia and actually do perhaps murder someone, get involved in drug trafficking. If the Russians capture them, they send them to jail. So even though you could look at the system as maybe a little problematic because of the conviction rate, there are Americans that probably, frankly, have violated Russian law and probably going to spend a good chunk of their lives in a Russian prison. But with someone like Brittany Griner, if the Russians arrest an American and then start to signal immediately that they want to use this person as a bargaining chip, well, now that case starts to look more wrongful. If a person is taken in, say, Venezuela, and they may have gone through some horrific treatment, well, then that case starts to look more like a wrongful detention. So the 11 factors are all taking a look at its totality, and innocence or guilt is not necessarily the only or the overriding factor in looking at these cases. The one thing I can tell you is that there's a very broad spectrum of the U.S. Department of State, people that are from the embassy, the building, the legal side, my side, consular affairs, and a few others that all get together and review the same facts. And if the facts speak to a wrongful detention, then that case comes over to me. So every case is undergoing a great review. There are cases that we're still trying to figure out what happened. We're trying to get more facts. So once we take a look at a case, it might stay open until we can finally conclude with some level of assurance that the case was either wrongful or not. But that's kind of the process. It's been very helpful to have that criteria. It gives us a way of talking about this with our allies, with the families, and definitely with those who have oversight over what we do, members of Congress.
Josh, I want to talk about the prominence of America's role. American hostages are actually more likely than most other nationals to remain in captivity or die, certainly more likely than other Western nation citizens. Some people think it's obviously because of America's prominent role on the world stage. It paints a target on people. As a journalist, we're often warned about these things by the State Department, that if I'm the first person into a particular area to cover a conflict or cover something, I'm going to have a big target on my back, and that's likely to happen. What do you do about that? I mean, we don't build our foreign policy on the basis of whether some other country is going to like it or not. We don't limit, generally speaking, the State Department puts out warnings, but we don't limit the ability of people to travel and do work in other countries. So how do you deal with the fact that, yeah, being an American puts a target on your back?
So I think there are a couple of pieces. One is to try to do, as you've indicated, Ali, everything we can do, really should responsibly do as a government to warn Americans. And we've upped our game in that respect too. It was just this summer, in fact, that the State Department announced a new indicator, a D for wrongful detention indicator, that will match what are already the prose descriptions of countries like Russia and Venezuela in the travel advisory warnings that sit on the State Department website. That's something of a complement to the K for kidnapping, essentially hostage taking, indicator that's existed for a few years at state. And we think we owe it to Americans to warn them in as crisp, as clear terms as possible. And also, we think we owe it to the world to be willing to call out those who engage in this behavior. That said, whatever the warnings one provides, Americans travel around the world, often for very noble causes. You travel, Ali, to shine light on what's happening in some of the toughest parts of the world so that Americans and others can understand that. Journalists are taken, aid workers are taken, a whole host of folks whose cause is noble or otherwise, nonetheless leaves them in the category of folks that we as a government, whatever the warnings provided earlier, feel a responsibility to work to get home. That doesn't change the moral culpability which belongs on those who take them in the first place.
Right.
We, as Roger emphasized, we see ourselves, we want to be, we work hard to be good partners to the family, to the friends of those who miss their loved ones and want to bring them home. We see ourselves as in the same boat as them and working day in and day out to provide them with information, learn from them, and partner with them. But ultimately, the moral opprobrium is on those who engage in this, whether they are governments or whether they're criminals or whether they're terrorists or pirates. Those who do this are the ones undertaking appalling behavior.
Ambassador, obviously a lot of people who are attending and listening, and we've got a lot of them here, know the intricacies of some of these things, but I just want to go a little more broadly, because there were members of the public invited to attend this. My audience may not be clear on this. When someone is unjustly or unlawfully taken by a state actor, there are many people who say America is the most powerful country in the world, economically and militarily. Why can't we just bring down the hammer and get them back now? Why would it take months? Why are you talking to the IRS to explain not to collect their taxes? Why can't we do something, whether it's militarily or covertly or economically, now and get them back in 2 weeks?
Yeah, Ali, I love the urgency in your voice, because that's how I would say Josh and I treat this. I've often thought the State Department is, kind of like an aircraft carrier. It moves slowly, but in a very big way. I would say the SPEHA office is like a hospital emergency room. We try to approach this knowing that every day that someone's in a prison is not a good day for their families and the person being held. So with a sense of urgency, we try to bring the tools together. And if you bring the hammer down, let's use an example. Let's say that it was a military hammer. There are places where the military hammer might work, but Delta Force, for example, and SEAL Team 6 are probably not going to be able to go into most of the countries that are holding our citizens. They're not going to go into China. They're not going to go into Russia for probably obvious reasons. In terms of other tools that we can bring to bear, it's surprising when you get into the negotiation and you start to realize what's in the art of the possible to bring someone back, you realize that some of the sledgehammers might actually derail the good work that you're already doing to lure someone into bringing them back. I would say we're probably, at least in my mind, I often wrestled with tools that might be considered a hammer until I actually started to negotiate with the other side. And when you do that, the light starts to open and you realize you just have to bring both sides together. And again, sometimes that's more of a lure than a push. So the point is, I would say that the president is committed to bringing all Americans who are held hostage or wrongfully detained home. The State Department most certainly is. And we're going to burn the midnight oil until we're successful in our missions. At the end of the day, and this is the worst part about it, the other side gets a vote. They're holding the keys to the jail cell. And no matter what you bring to bear, whether it's a punishing activity or whether it's a conversation where you're trying to, I guess you say, come to common ground, the other side gets the final vote on whether they turn that key and let their American out or our American out.
It's a very thoughtful answer. Thank you for that. I want to go to the attendees and their questions. I've got a question from Mia Bloom. The academic research on hostage taking, much of it by Todd Sandler, argues that it's a very bad idea to pay for hostages and actually encourages more hostage taking. At the same time, the moral issues are complex. Example, Kayla Muller. Should the U.S. find third-party states to act as proxies, allowing them to balance the diametrically opposed pressures and find other ways to punish groups and states that take hostages? Josh, let me start with you on that.
I appreciate Mia's good question, and she's in some ways encapsulated the tension between two aspects of the work Roger and I and others try to do. Stop cases in the first place by not incentivizing them, and resolve the cases that do exist and continue to exist despite our warnings, despite our attempts to deter through punishment. So I do think that the role of partners can be critical in this. That's in part because those who take Americans, and this may be especially true with respect to non-state actors, are bad actors in the world. That's almost definitionally so. And there are partners, or there are those we can get to, who talk to all sorts of bad actors in the world. Some we deliberately do not otherwise talk to because we don't want to reward their sort of bad behavior. And we are always thinking about whom can we go to who might have a way in or some ability to reach, to serve as an intermediary to those who ultimately can open that jail cell, as Roger put it. I would add that part of the theory of the case behind the very role that Roger fills with such energy and talent right now was to have a position that made clear what was on the line, what was not on the line when that person engaged in diplomacy. In other words, to have a special presidential envoy for hostage affairs make clear that we will talk to those we need to talk to if it means getting an American home. Look, we brought Trevor Reed home from Russia in the midst of some of the lowest relations, I think for very good reason, that much of the world has had with Russia in many years. It also means that other things are not necessarily on the line. Doesn't mean we're wholly opening up to a country, but we are willing to talk to entities if it means bringing Americans home, and we're willing to work with partners to do so.
Ambassador, let me just ask you about what Josh said about the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, SPEHA, your office. It was born out of a 2015 presidential policy directive commissioned directly in response to the capture and execution of American citizens by ISIS in 2014. Tell us a little bit more about the infrastructure. What does this appointment and this office bring to the solution, and how has it, in your opinion, improved things? You're muted.
I would say that when I showed up in the office, I was employee number 4. Robert O'Brien had left a few months earlier. The office had 4 people, and it was always very small. I think I took a look at it and approached it like I would building out any organization. We needed doctrine, organization, manpower, finances, ways of doing business. So anything that you do to build out any organization is what we tried to apply. Now we're currently up to about 24 people. And that includes people that we've asked to have on loan, on detail from other government agencies. So I'd say for a starter, a good answer to that might be that there's now a focal point at the Department of State. There's a focal point that reaches out through the interagency, that brings interagency people into our environment. And that allows us to come up with essentially a campaign plan on every case on how best to get it done. So whether it's in Venezuela, China, Russia, or pick your country, we'll have people that are talking to all members of the interagency to come up with that, at least the initial focus, the initial shot before you engage. And then once you start engaging with the other side, adapting the strategy to fit what's happening at the negotiation table. That's something we didn't have before. We now have that capability to put brain power, time, and effort, and interagency firepower, if you will, into every case. We also are able to talk to the families. I think before we started hiring people, I would talk to pretty much 40 families. Now, I still spend 1 to 4 hours talking to families every day, but it almost becomes untenable. I'm not able to give them the love and attention and care that I need if it's just me. Now we have case officers and a family engagement team that can spend time making sure that the needs of the family members are met. And I would say thirdly, and I thank the president for the executive order that was passed and also the Levinson Act, we're now, in a way, kind of a quote unquote real thing. We're able to seek funding, resources. It's now an established entity, and that allows us to get on the plane and actually fly forward to talk to the other side. I think there was a time when the other side, whether it be any of these countries, they weren't really talking to us. We weren't really bringing good strategies to bear. And I think the office now allows us to have the WASTA, the gravitas, the whatever it is that allows the other side to answer the phone, agree to meet, and then we go forward to see if we can hash out a deal. And it comes from the strong support of the White House, the strong support of Secretary Blinken. But we're in a better place than we were back in 2015. But Ali, we're not done yet. If you and I were sitting down with a beer over 3 or 4 hours, Josh and I would probably tell you where our weak points are and what we're going to try to improve as time goes on. But the good news is Josh and I, in a way, have a get well plan. We just have to devote the time and effort into taking us to the next level. If SPEHA 2.0 is currently in effect, SPEHA 3.0 is on the horizon, and we're working towards that.
It's an interesting point. Ambassador John Huntsman once said to me that no matter how much of an adversary you think of in another country, you need a hotline between the two generals to say, tell them not to fire on that plane, otherwise we're going to start a war. And
he's
I think
absolutely right.
You're describing something like that. Maybe SPEHA is a hotline. And Joshua, let's talk about that a little bit because the administration has thought that it has had success, citing in particular Afghanistan, Venezuela, Russia, and Burma. Speak broadly about what looks like success, because unfortunately in this world, there feels to the public to be more failure than success, right? Every now and then you see a hostage freed, but more often than not, you hear about a hostage taken. And I don't know whether that's just a perception problem or not, but you feel that there have been successes with this particular iteration of trying to work to free unjustly held people.
Look, there absolutely have been successes, as you say, Afghanistan, Venezuela, Russia, Burma, Haiti, other countries that I am deliberately not mentioning because we have very quietly resolved cases there. A recent case reported in West Africa. Again, we tend to respect the privacy of those who are returning to U.S. soil, let them decide what they want to talk about, whether they want to talk about their experience. But there have been, thanks to Roger, thanks to the team, and he has a state, thanks to the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell at FBI, thanks to our embassies, there have been the most obvious form of success, which is when an American who has been held hostage or wrongfully detained comes home. That's easy as a good day. There are lots of hard days, and as Roger said, every day, that someone who should not be held is held, often in horrific conditions, almost by definition horrific, in that they're not where they should be and far from their friends and family. That is a hard day for them, for their family and friends, and for all of us who care deeply about these cases. I do think there are other successes in the gray area between those. When we're able to issue an executive order that creates a whole new suite of penalties to try to deter the next case, when we introduce a new type of warning, a crisper, clearer type of warning that can stop an American from traveling somewhere where they become the next wrongful detention, those sorts of steps are important days, even if nothing's as good as the day when a hostage or a wrongful detainee actually comes home.
Ambassador, we don't want to get involved in the business of victim blaming, but I'm sure there are days when you hear of a case and you thought, well, if only they knew, or if only they were better prepared, or whatever the case is. What should Americans know? We've talked about missionaries. We've talked about aid workers. We've talked about journalists. We know why some people go into some of these places, but what should Americans, what would you like people to be thinking about with respect to this increase in state actors detaining Americans?
Well, I'd say 5 things. The first is if you're going to travel, get informed. Now, I used to travel quite a bit. And if in my 20s, if someone would have said, have you checked the State Department website? First off, I'm so old, there were no websites back then. But I probably would have said, well, no, I did not. I'd like people to start looking at our website. We actually, as Josh said, it's not just on whether you might be taken as a wrongful detainee. It's on crime, it's on disasters, it's on kidnapping. So the State Department website, type in the country that you're going to, and you're going to get a good sense of what's required in turn, or really helps you decide whether to go or not. Secondly, get the required documents. A lot of times that might include visas. The U.S. passport might have the right amount of validity. You might want to make sure you have your prescription medicine information and any consent for traveling with minors. Sometimes you go overseas, and what initially gets you thrown into the jail, it's almost a bureaucratic thing. It's a paperwork thing. Thirdly, you can enroll in something called the Smart Traveler Enrollment Program, or STEP. And what that does is that sends messages, it pushes message to you on the safety and security of places that you might be going to. Lastly, or I'll say not lastly, number 4, you could consider enrolling in an insurance program. If anything happens, you come up with an illness, you are taken, you need to get out of country, you can actually get insurance that will actually help you, someone proactively coming to get you and making sure you get to a safe place. But the last thing I want everyone to know is, in a way, it doesn't matter. Your blue passport means something to this government. If you carry a blue passport, it doesn't matter if you're a dual national. It doesn't matter if you were probably not supposed to go to that country. It doesn't matter if you went by every warning that you could possibly get. If another country or a terrorist group takes you hostage, the United States is obligated and wants to come and get you because the blue passport matters.
Josh, it's interesting because when you talk about the consolidated multilateral effort to, come up with a system and get governments to come together, as Ambassador Carstens says, to either punish or help, depending on which side you're looking at. What stands in the way of that? Because on one level, it would seem obvious, right? Again, I'm going to go back to the NATO example. Vladimir Putin didn't want the expansion of NATO, and he got himself the expansion of NATO. And there are all sorts of countries not in Europe, not connected to another NATO country, who are thinking, hey, this might be a good plan. It seems obvious that countries would want to join this multilateral approach. Why isn't everybody right now?
I think there are a few things that make it hard. And in some ways, what's hard is less getting people to sign up, because Canada, with our support and others, we have gotten countries to, especially our close allies, to sign up. I think what can be hard is how to make that effective, how to have the bite necessary to deter. And there, it is the same countries that are often the subject of existing penalties, sanctions, travel bans, whatever it might be, that engage in this sort of behavior, the pariahs, in a sense, for the set of countries willing to sign up, who then show their pariah status by taking an American unjustly or unlawfully and holding them. It makes it hard then to take what's already often a strained relationship and figure out essentially how to deliberately strain it further so as to punish them and get that American home. The other thing I'd say is this is, like so many hard problems, bigger than governments, or at least it could and should be. There are things that bad countries, bad governments have done over human history, where not only have governments used things, whether those are financial, whether those involve denouncing them in multilateral fora like the UN, but where the private sector or the nonprofit sector have added their voice, withheld their dollars, joined together and say, if we see this happen to one American there, that is the last time we will go there for this sort of tour, or send this sort of athlete, or engage in this sort of way, or set up that sort of concert. And so when those outside of government ask me a question that I, of course, love to be asked, which is, how can we help? What can we do? One of my answers is help those entities outside government join us in making this closer to the flick of a switch, that when a wrongful detention, an unlawful detention occurs, there is a powerful, formidable reaction, not just from the US government, not just from the allies who signed on to this Canadian-led initiative, but also by parts of the private sector, the academic sector, the nonprofit sector, that show just what a foolish thing it can be to engage in this sort of appalling behavior.
Ambassador, let me ask you about prisoner exchanges. The average person may not have a strong view on this until it seems relevant to them, or they associate with a particular case, like Brittany Griner's. What's the good and bad of prisoner exchanges? Josh spoke earlier to the fact that we believe that people who are held in U.S. prisons have been given proper due process. But when Russia says, you give us Victor Bout for Brittany Griner, how do you process that? Because families will ask that question. Have we got somebody we can hand over to get our loved ones back?
Yeah, thank you for that. It is a tough proposition. I'll tell you that there's really been only one case in 2.5 years that didn't require us to at least consider something that was going to be very painful to do. I think you'll notice that President Biden's made some very hard choices to bring some Americans back. So swaps, while abhorrent, might be the right tool to use in a certain case. I can tell you that anything that we consider, whether it's that or any of the other things that might be on the table, we usually want to make sure that the other side does not gain any benefit, either materially or you could say politically. That's an important thing. You never want to give the captor group or the captor nation something that's going to alter their balance and provide them a benefit. Having said that, though, we're faced with a slew of really tough choices, and sometimes that's why this takes so long. I think Josh brought up the times that countries will ask for something that's just absolutely impossible to give. It's morally wrong. If they ask for something just underneath that, that's something that at least we have to consider. But that doesn't stop us from also thinking creatively about trying to find other lines of effort, or to think about things that might actually be interesting to that country that have mutual benefit. There are a few times where we've gone to another country and said, look, you want this, we want this, and I'm not talking about a swap. Can we do something here that actually benefits your populace, which is something that the United States of America would actually think to be the right thing to do? Would that be what can solve this case here? So maybe not answering the question entirely, but to say that we're seldom given a bunch of good options. But Josh and I spend a lot of time trying to come up with those creative win-wins, if possible, to make this more palatable for people that come home. Because at the end of the day, you know, you mentioned that you don't want to put people at risk by giving another side, be it let's say the Russians in this case, giving up something which is going to make them want to take another American later on down the road. That puts you, Ali Velshi, at risk, and it puts other just average Americans and really citizens of the world at large if the Russians think that they can turn this into a cottage industry. And I'm sorry to pick on Russia. I probably should just use it country indiscriminate, but
Right.
to get a sense of where we are with the Brittany Griner case.
Yeah,
So,
look, that's me. I've been using it because it's in the zeitgeist at the moment. There are lots of other countries and lots of other people being held by other countries that are not in the zeitgeist. But that's a very nuanced answer, and I want to go to Josh with a little more on this carrot and stick idea, or what the ambassador said is something just underneath that. How do you propose that sort of thing to a country so that it doesn't feel like, all right, you got one of our people, you're going to get something you didn't think you were going to get. It may benefit you. It may benefit us. It can't look like we're paying for a hostage or giving you some trade deal that you're getting because of this. But there may be this separate and beneficial thing that can happen to you. That's a very tricky dance.
It's very hard. That's why Roger works such long days, and his team and others across the government to care about these things, because it is very hard. But at the same time, we try to be creative, and we try to be collectively creative here. And there are, first of all, there are consequences to taking Americans that governments may not realize. That sometimes they've not even decided to go out and pick up an American, so to speak. That someone has entered their system in some ways, and they make a choice to manipulate and exploit that. And there's a communicative possibility there of saying, do you realize how much this will set you back in the eyes of the American people, in the eyes of the world? How do we find a way out of this? Because you've just done something you thought was beneficial, and in fact, you've made a huge mistake. That happens to be true. Doesn't mean they always recognize that as such, but that's on a spectrum. Then there's a spectrum of, look, we've wanted to have a conversation about X other issue for a while, but we've told you we can't yet. If, as a matter of confidence building, you could show us that you're the sort of good faith actor that returns an American rather than continues to hold one against his or her will, wrongfully or unlawfully, that begins to be the sort of confidence building step that might enable us to then have a conversation about X or Y other topic that you were looking to have. Overall, I'd say we just try to be as creative as we can, because our sense of urgency, as Roger put it before, is high. It should be high for every day that passes. And at the same time, our sense of not incentivizing the next one and just creating more days of urgency and more pain is also high, and it should be high. So to figure out what can come in between, what either recognition about how bad this will be if it continues for the government that's done it, or how to unlock something that's mutually beneficial anyway and have the resolution of a case be part of that, that's all the sort of thing we spend time thinking about and questioning, and having our experts across the government give us a sense of how it will play out 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps down the road, and then figuring out how we can turn it into a resolution of the case.
Ambassador, I want to talk to you about social media and publicity. On May 30th, 2018, Bill Browder, who had been, the Russians were looking for him. That, I think most people would call an unjust detention. If they got him, they asked for an Interpol red notice. Most countries decided to ignore that, but he got picked up by Spanish authorities. It was, like you said, it was some kind of an unusual situation. He got picked up. They didn't take his phone away, and he immediately tweeted. And of course, he's got a very, very big platform, and all sorts of people saw it and deluged the Spanish government and the provincial government where he was with requests and all that. And it ended up resulting in him being released and not going to jail. But had he been detained, had he been sent to Russia, who knows what would have happened. What's the role of social media, of people and their families agitating on social media, or in that case, acting in an emergency fashion to say, hey, I've been arrested?
So I'm going to give you an answer that may surprise you. There's a myth out there that the US government's going to tell you to be quiet if you're a family, like be quiet, let's resolve this, stay off social media, stay away from the newspapers. In all reality, when we show up in a family's living room after we've declared them to have wrongful detention, we tell them a few things. Number one, they have a narrative, they have a story they have to tell, and they have to choose how they want to tell it. Is it going to be on Twitter, an op-ed? Do they want to stay quiet? Do they want to try to go on a news program? So we recognize that some of their pain is dealt with by perhaps expressing what is happening to their loved ones so that they can take action, take agency. But we also say at times there can be a cost. If you're insulting the leader of the country who is holding your loved one, you're now making this personal. So we'll advise them, if you ever do go to the media, whether it's Twitter or social media writ large, you want to make sure that you're highlighting the problem, maybe calling the country out in question, but don't make it personal. Aside from that, I can think in 2.5 years, there's only been one case where I've had to ask a family member to please be quiet, lay low for a few weeks, because we have something in train. And if anything hits the media, it might make it difficult for us to get to this next position. And that person kindly spent 2 or 3 weeks laying low. I called that person at the very end of the completion of the negotiation, the sensitive negotiation. And I said, you're free to do whatever you want. And then he quickly put an op-ed, and I think it was the Wall Street Journal, if I'm not mistaken. So I guess it's different in every case. They go through different phases, and we try to give this family a full suite, or I'll say a full understanding of what's good about media engagement, what's not good about media engagement. We try to give them a few tips, and frankly, we also link them up with other families. There are other families out there that have seemingly mastered the media space. And it's not unusual for us to link them up by email, and then that family can get mentored by another family that's been down that road for a year or two. But overall, each case is different. If someone was picked up in country X, I'd say scream as loud as you can, make it as hard as possible for everyone. Go to the top of the mountain and shout. There are 1 or 2 other countries where I'd say, consider what you're going to say, be thoughtful, because this country might take it a little more personally. We might not be in a position like that. But overall, we leave it up to the family members, and we're supportive, even to the point, if they want to criticize Josh and I for our efforts, that's not going to slow Josh and I down. We're still going to try to get their loved ones home, and we're going to accept it. These families they're in pain. They have a role to play. And if their role's in the media space, that might not be a bad thing. It can cut both ways, but it might not be a bad thing.
What a great answer. Thank you to you. We've gone a little longer than we had planned because we got a little bit of a later start. But I'm a lot smarter for this conversation. I'm sure our attendees are. Ambassador Roger Carstens is the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs at the State Department. Joshua Geltzer is the Deputy Assistant to the President and the Department of Homeland, Deputy Homeland Security Advisor. Thanks to both of you. I'm going to hand it over to Naureen to close it up.
Not much more for me to say other than thank you so much for joining us and for this really nuanced and rich discussion. I think you've touched on a lot of different perspectives, and I think for many of our audience, that differential sort of number of questions and issues between state actors and non-state actors and all the nuances involved are really key to think about. So hopefully this isn't the end of the conversation, but the beginning, and we look forward to staying in touch. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Naureen.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ali. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.